Welcome to Hardwood Home Lab, everybody. My name is Kyle, and today I'm going to be setting up a template on Proxmox using a Debian cloud image. Then I'm going to use a Cloud-Init vendor file to define which packages need to be installed or any commands that need to be run to bring that virtual machine to the desired state. If you're interested in seeing how I do this, then come check it out. Alright, so I'm signed into Proxmox here, and unfortunately the process of taking a cloud image and turning it into a template is going to be pretty command line driven. So a good majority of it's going to be happening on the shell in Proxmox. But the first thing I'm going to need is actually a cloud image. And since I'm using Debian, I've signed in here to cloud.debian.org. And in here, I'm just going to scroll down towards the bottom. I want to use Trixie because that's the latest version of Debian. And they have a latest directory in here. That's the one I'm going to use. And I'm actually going to use just the generic one. You'll want to make sure that you grab an image that matches the architecture that you have. This AMD 64 one here is for x86 systems. We have also for ARM systems down here, and even for RISC-V if you've got a RISC-V processor. Although I imagine for most people watching this, it's going to be the x86 versions or the AMD 64. And I'm not actually going to download it onto my system. I'm just going to right-click and copy the link address. You probably can't see this on the recording, but I'm just copying the address of this particular file. So I'll switch back over to my Proxmox server, and I'm going to go to the shell. In here, I'm just going to use the command wget, and I'm going to paste that URL that I just copied. And that's going to download the cloud image onto Proxmox. I'm going to speed this up, and when it's done, I'll carry on. Now I'm going to need a virtual machine that I'm going to import this image onto. And that's what I'm going to convert into my template. And in order to do that, I'm going to run this command right here. So this is a command that I grabbed actually right off the Proxmox forums. And it's going to create a virtual machine with the number of 9,000. It's only going to have 1 gigabyte of memory. It's going to create a bridge network device that's tied in with VMBR0. And it's also identifying the SCSI hardware that's going to match this Cloud-Init image. If you want to, or if you need to, you can change the virtual machine ID number to whatever you want. I typically leave these in the 900 range, so I'm just going to change that to match my current configuration. You can also give it as much memory as you want. 1 gig is plenty for what I'm doing in this video, so that's what I'm going to run. And if I open up the sidebar here, you can see that new virtual machine is created. However, there is no storage attached to it yet, so I'm going to need to import this image into that virtual machine. So to do that, I just copied the next command, and since I changed this ID, I'm going to have to change this number to match the ID that I used up here. It's going to take this file that I downloaded and import it into this virtual machine. Now, even on my low-powered system, that only took a few seconds. That's because this is a really small file. It's only 3 gigs. So here we can actually leave the shell, and we're going to start using the web UI to do some final configurations on here. So in this VM, I'm just going to select the hardware. As of late, I've been playing with virtual machines that are using UEFI virtual hardware. So that's what I'm going to set up in this video. But if you want to use just the default BIOS, you can actually just skip this section and it'll work just fine. So if you're going to be using UEFI virtual hardware, we're going to need to add an EFI disk. So I'll just select that. And I'm just going to put this on the local LVM storage. And I'll put that as OK. And I'm also going to need to change the BIOS to UEFI. And the last thing I'm going to need to change is the machine type. So I'm just going to edit that. And I'm going to put this as Q35. So that's all I needed to do to enable UEFI. The next thing I want to do is change the hard disk size. These cloud images have no room to spare on them. So I'm just going to add an extra gig on here. I'll resize it. Add 1 gigabyte. I like to add an extra gig of space on here at this point in the sequence, since if I forget to increase the storage space on any clones that I make from this template, I'm not going to be bottlenecking the boot up process of Cloud-Init. Because the first time that you start up Cloud-Init, it's going to update your packages in the background when it boots. And if you've defined any packages for it to install, it's going to have space for it to install those. Speaking of Cloud-Init, I'm going to need to add a Cloud-Init drive. I'm just going to put that on local LVM as well. And with that, the virtual hardware is configured. There's a few things I'd like to change as well under the options. So I'm going to edit the name on here. I'm just going to call this one Debian Trixie, so I know it's the latest version of Debian. I'm also going to want to change the boot order, because right now it's going to try to net boot. When this virtual machine was created, there was no storage device on here, so it defaulted to a net boot. So I'm just going to edit this. I'm actually just going to move this virtual storage device to the top. I'm going to enable it so that it boots from that first. And then click OK. So technically at this point, you could just convert it to a template right now and start using this image. If you do, you're not going to have a default user for your Cloud-Init, and there's a couple of other things that I like to change as well before I template this. For one, I want to have the QEMU guest agent automatically enabled. So I'm going to edit this, use QEMU guest agent, and click OK. And then I like to have some Cloud-Init settings in here so that if I clone a template, it will automatically have some default values in here. So I'm going to give this a user, going to give it a password. If you have an SSH public key, it's not a bad idea to put it in here right now. If you're the type that uses a different SSH key for each individual machine, then you may not want to put that in here now, but I'm going to for this demonstration. So with my public SSH key in here, I'm going to hit OK. And I also like to configure the network so that it uses DHCP. I manage all my IP addresses from DHCP reservations on my router. So I'm just going to edit this, make sure that IPv4 is on DHCP. I'm not using IPv6 in my home lab at the moment, so I'm just going to leave that as static. Now that's all the Cloud-Init settings you can do from the web UI. Now this is where I'm going to get into the magic bullet. I have never been sold on using cloud images for templates like this because there are always some packages that I want to have pre-installed. Everything that I have read previously has told me that you can use Cloud-Init definition files within Proxmox, but when you do that, it actually disables everything that I've just set up here in that last step. I have since learned that you can use a Cloud-Init vendor file that will not affect the settings that we just did in that last step. So with a vendor file, you can actually define any packages that you want to be installed on initial boot. You can also have it run any other tasks that you need to from the command line. So I'm going to show you what that looks like right now. I'm going to need to change the storage settings on this Proxmox node before I can. And I'm going to go to the data center under storage right here. I'm going to grab my local storage and I'm just going to edit this. And I want to enable snippets on here. So I'm just going to highlight that. You can see it's highlighted in the list. And I'll hit OK. The snippets is where those Cloud-Init config files are going to have to live. So I'm just going to create one now. And in order to do that, I need to go back to the Proxmox shell. In here, I'm just going to change directories to var lib, I think it was VZ, and then I'll make sure that snippets directory was created. That snippets directory wasn't here on the local storage before I had made that change in the data center. If you're not seeing a snippets directory here, that's probably why. You may have skipped the step where you need to add it to your storage. So inside this snippets directory, I'm going to create the Cloud-Init vendor file. And I'm just going to use Vim for that. By the way, Vim is not pre-installed on Proxmox. This is just my text editor of choice. If you prefer to use Nano, I believe that's pre-installed. It does have Vi on its own if you prefer to use that too. But I'm going to call this one Debian Trixie.yaml. And the reason I'm calling it Debian Trixie is I like to have it match the template name. I'll know that this vendor file ties in with that particular template. And I'll show you why in a couple minutes. So in here, I've created a vendor file. I'm just going to copy this from my notes, and I'm going to paste it in here. One thing to note, it has a cloud config declaration line at the top. This has to be there. So if you're having issues with your vendor file, double check that you have this cloud config at the top, because if you don't, it won't work. Ask me how I know. So I just added a bunch of packages that I want it to install. So it's going to install the QEMU guest agent. That will correspond with the option that I put on the template for running QEMU guest agent. I've installed Vimnox because that's, once again, my text editor of choice. I'm going to have uncomplicated firewall, or UFW, and HTOP because that's a feature that I use quite regularly on my virtual machines. And then once it installs those packages, it's going to run these commands. So it's going to run them as root in the background when I clone my virtual machine. So what it's doing is allowing SSH through the firewall. It's going to enable the firewall, and then it's going to reboot the system after all of this stuff is done. So that's what I want my Cloud-Init config to look like. So I will write this out, and now I need to set my template to use this vendor file. So I'm just going to paste in this command, and you're going to need to change the VM ID number to match your template. And you'll also need to change the name of that YAML file that you just created. So you can see right above here, it's Debian Trixie. So I'm going to change this to match it. Whoops. And I'm going to type it correctly. So with that command, it's going to update this virtual machine here to be associated with this Cloud-Init vendor file. That's everything that I'm going to do to use this as a template. So I'm going to right-click on this virtual machine and convert to template. Okay, so now I'm ready to test this out, and I'm just going to clone my template. So clone. We're going to do a full clone. I'm just going to put this in a temporary number space. Whoops, go 700. I'll just call this one for now. Okay, so my template's been cloned, and I'm ready to start this up. However, this virtual machine has minimal resources allocated to it right now, so I'm just going to give it a little more juice. Not a whole lot. I've got 1 GB of memory attached, so I'm just going to increase this, let's say, to 3072, so 3 gigs. And let's give it 1 more core. All right, so this shouldn't start up at a snail's pace, so I'm just going to click Start. And I'm going to go to the summary page here to see what happens. And there we go. It took a couple minutes, and you can see it found the IP address of the guest system that's running on Proxmox right now. That's telling me that the QEMU guest agent is up and running. So if I go into the console here, I want to make sure that my user was created, which was Hardwood Home Lab, and I can sign in. I can also update the packages. And you can see that everything is up to date. So that's what those couple minutes took. It actually took a minute to install HTOP, to install UFW, to install Vimnox, and all of it is up and running now. And I'll prove it to you. I'll take a look at my UFW status. and you can see it's active and only allowing port 22 for SSH. HTOP is installed and very usable. So by using that vendor file, I have been able to define a state that I want my virtual machine to be in once I've cloned that template. And you can do this in many other ways. I'm going to shut this down and I'm going to show you how I'm using this personally. As I've shown you, by cloning this Debian Trixie template, I will come up with a fairly generic Debian system. What if I wanted to have Docker pre-installed and I want to use the Docker install script? I can do that as well. So I'm just going to clone this virtual machine. I'm going to put this on 901. Going to give it a full clone again. A linked clone actually for this would probably be okay. But I'm going to call this one Docker. And we're going to clone that. With this clone, I'm going to create a new template. So this new template is identical to the Debian Trixie template at this point, but I can define a new vendor file just for that specific template. So that's what I'll do right now. I'll go into the shell. I'm going to run vim. That was under var lib vz snippets, and in this one I'm going to create a vendor file called docker.yaml. So that's why I like having the vendor file name match the template. If you do that all the way along, if you get rid of a template for whatever reason, then you're going to know exactly which vendor file matches the template. In here, and I'm going to paste in a second configuration file. Now in this one, it looks very similar to the last one I've shown you, only in here, after installing the same packages that I showed in the last vendor file, it's going to also enable the firewall, and then it's going to install Docker using their one-line install script, and then it's going to add my user to the Docker group. Then it's going to reboot, and I'll be able to use Docker just like I normally do. So I'm going to write this file, then I'm going to need to associate that vendor file with that template. So I've put that one at 901. We need to have that ID matching. Make sure the vendor file also matches what you've created. And you can see that this vendor file has now been associated with that virtual machine. One of the things that I like about this is if you've made a mistake, even if your VM is templated, you can go in and modify the vendor file afterwards and you can still use it. So for instance, if that Docker install script got moved to a different location, I can just go into this vendor file, change that command, and save it. I don't have to reassociate it or anything. It will just work. That's pretty awesome. So I'll show you what that looks like. It's pretty much more of the same. So I'm just going to take my Docker template. I'm going to clone that. I'll put this one on 700 as well because I deleted the last example. I'll call this one forever. We'll do a full clone here and start that. And once again, I want to stress the reason that I like this method is because it doesn't disable what you've done in the GUI. So now that I've cloned this, I can go into Cloud-Init. If I change my user, I'll put it as my name and I'll edit the password. These changes that I've made will carry through to the rest of the Cloud-Init boot up process. That vendor file didn't affect the way the GUI works. So and before I forget, I'll better put some more resources to this so that it boots up fairly quick, and we'll start this up. All right, so it took a couple minutes for that Cloud-Init to start up, run its bootstrap script, for lack of a better word, and reboot. Now that it's started up, I should be able to sign in as the user I defined in my Cloud-Init drive. So I'm going to use my name and the new password. And once again, I can sign in. Now to see if Docker is installed, I'm going to use Docker run. I'll use hello world. And you'll notice that I am not using sudo, so if I am part of the Docker user group, this should run without any issues. If I'm not, then it should fail. And just like that, my user is part of the Docker group. So this is what sold me on using cloud images for templating on my Proxmox system. With this method, I can use the same cloud image to boot legacy BIOS systems, to boot UEFI. I can use it to have predefined outcomes that I want, like I've just demonstrated with Docker. I can have it automatically download and run a bootstrap script from one of my other servers. It is almost limitless. So that's currently how I'm doing templating on Proxmox. If you have a better way, I'd love to hear it. But in the meantime, my name is Kyle. This is Hardwood Home Lab, and I'll see you in the next one.